Joining us now here on set for the interview is Lisa Page. She's a former FBI lawyer, special counsel to Deputy FBI Director Andrew McCabe. Lisa Page has been the target of unrelenting attacks from President Trump and his allies ever since the Justice Department published her personal text messages 2 years ago. This is her first television interview since leaving the FBI last year. Ms. Page, thanks very much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
In terms of the way this played out, ultimately, you've become a poster child, along with several of your colleagues, for these claims from the president, and now increasingly from the current attorney general, that the Trump-Russia investigation was cooked up on the basis of false allegations or even some sort of conspiracy, specifically to hurt his chances of getting elected. Now, of course, the problem there is that nobody in the country knew about that investigation before people had the chance to vote on him. And I mean, as an observer, I find that flabbergasting. How does it strike you, and how does that comport with your understanding of that process, given what you just described?
There is no one on this set of facts who has any experience in counterintelligence who would not have made the exact same decision. This is a question about whether Russia is working with a United States person to interfere in our election. We were obligated to figure out whether that was true or not, and to figure out who might be in a position to provide that assistance.
In terms of the critique that I just implicitly made, that if there had been some sort of conspiracy against candidate Trump, that could have just as easily been leaked to the public so people would know about that when they went to the polls, is that a fair critique?
It is a fair critique, but we were extraordinarily careful not to do anything that would allow this information to get out before we knew what we had.
You described, as I mentioned, the sort of self-consciousness around the Clinton investigation, that everybody involved was very conscious that everything that was done was going to be scrutinized, that anticipatory sense of scrutiny, as I've talked to James Comey about, it seemed to drive some of the decisions in terms of public disclosure, in terms of what kind of blowback the FBI would get. Given what has happened ultimately to everybody who was involved in that Russia investigation, do you look back now and recognize any of the same self-consciousness about that? Was it the same sense that this sort of scrutiny or blowback was going to be brought to bear on all of you?
I wouldn't characterize it that way, because this was a counterintelligence investigation, first and foremost. You know, the FBI conducts counterintelligence investigations every day, and no one ever hears about them, and no one will. So it's entirely possible that this investigation could have ended that way had nothing been found, had there been no relationship between people on the Trump campaign and people in Russia. It's entirely possible this could have remained a secret investigation for the very reason that you wouldn't want to unfairly prejudice if in fact you didn't find sufficient connections between the Russian Federation and members of the Trump campaign. That's obviously not what Mueller ultimately found, but you shouldn't assume that a counterintelligence investigation will be made public, because the vast majority of them are not.
Given what you've been through over the past couple of years, why speak now on your own terms?
Honestly, I just wasn't planning to, and I didn't want to. I've led an entirely anonymous life and hoped to return to one. And when the president, finally did that vile sort of simulated sex act in a rally in Minneapolis, I just finally had to accept it's not getting better, and being quiet isn't making this go away. And it wasn't working for me anymore.
Since you did the interview with the Daily Beast, and since you opened your public Twitter account and have been able to make public statements in that forum, the president has not slowed down. He, last week at a rally, I believe, intimated or said that he didn't know if it was true or not, but he heard that she'd had to get a restraining order against Peter Strzoknow, and that's how that all worked out. You have said publicly on Twitter that that's a lie. Nothing like that ever happened.
Of course not.
But if this doesn't slow down the president attacking you, is it still the right thing to do?
I mean, it hasn't changed, so I don't see why I would continue doing the same thing.
Yeah.
At least I have my voice out there. At least if you want to respond to me instead of this caricature that you've drawn up about me.
Can you talk about what it was like and sort of how you found out and what your thought process was when you learned that these text messages that had been investigated by the Inspector General had not just made their way into public consumption, but had actually been given to reporters by the Justice Department, who told reporters that they shouldn't source them to the Justice Department and explain where they got them. But it was, in fact, the DOJ who gave them out.
That's correct.
Tell me how that felt.
I mean, it's really one of the more painful aspects of this entire 2 years. I mean, the president's attacks and assaults are one thing, but this is my institution. This is my Justice Department betraying us. And, you know, there's an element of, or at least there's a claim that, well, this is congressional oversight and we had to do it. I have been a part of both of these institutions for a long time, and I know what it looks like when when the department is trying to protect people and protect information, and I know what it looks like when they're not. There were plenty of ways to fulfill their congressionally mandated oversight responsibility without politicizing our messages, without shoveling them out in the way that they did.
Why do you think they did it?
Well, my speculation is because this was not a great time for the Justice Department. You had Attorney General Sessions constantly beleaguered and being lambasted by the president for failing to sufficiently protect him. You had Rod Rosenstein going to the Hill early the next morning. I think it served a useful foil.
One of the things that's happened over the course of these past couple of years is that you've been this sort of apogee point in terms of the way the president and his supporters and conservative media have gone after you. But we've also seen different iterations of it against other civil servants and career public servants, people like Marie Yovanovitch and Fiona Hill and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman and others who have popped up in the impeachment investigation as fact witnesses. I wonder if that, too, has sort of inflected your feeling about any of this, or if you have anything that you'd like to say in terms of the way that they've been treated.
I mean, it's deeply unfair. We are all public servants. This is simply not the way, even with wrongdoing, even if you think that my text messages were a mistake, this is not how public servants should be treated. And moreover, those institutions should be coming to their defense. You know, we can't control what the president says, but sure as the day is long, Attorney General Barr could say something about whether this was appropriate or not. Secretary Pompeo could say something about whether these people deserved the lambasting that they've gotten.
In terms of the text messages and the allegations that have been made against you, you've sort of explained yourself in putting those text messages in greater context in terms of what they meant and the way they were used against you. Can you explain to us tonight what was meant by, for example, the insurance policy text message? So this is you and Peter Strzok texting about the prospect that President Trump is going to be elected, the unlikely prospect.
Right. I mean, it's an analogy. First of all, it's not my text, so I'm sort of interpreting what I believe he meant back 3 years ago. But we're using an analogy. We're talking about whether or not we should take certain investigative steps or not based on the likelihood that he's going to be president or not, right? You have to keep in mind, if President Trump doesn't become president, the national security risk, if there is somebody in his campaign associated with Russia, plummets. You're not so worried about what Russia's doing vis-a-vis a member of his campaign if he's not president, because you're not going to have access to classified information. You're not going to have access to sources and methods in our national security apparatus. So the insurance policy was an analogy. It's like an insurance policy when you're 40. You don't expect to die when you're 40, yet you still have an insurance policy.
So don't just hope that he's not going to be elected and therefore not press forward with the investigation hoping, but rather press forward with the investigation just in case he does get in there.
Exactly.
What about the text message that in which you and Strzok were talking about your sort of fear that Trump would be elected, and he said, no, we won't let it happen?
I mean, by we, he's talking about the collective we. Like-minded, thoughtful, sensible people who were not going to vote this person into office. You know, obviously, in retrospect, do I wish he hadn't sent it? Yes. It's been mutilated to death, and it's been used to bludgeon an institution I love, and it's meant that I've disappointed countless people. But this is a snapshot in time, carrying on a conversation that had happened earlier in the day that reflected a broad sense of he's not going to be president. We, the democratic people of this country, are not going to let it happen.
And in terms of the litigation of this issue, the question about whether or not this, as the president and his supporters claim, reflected some inherent political bias by you and Mr. Strzok, and that you had key roles to play in these investigations, and therefore the investigations are biased. I mean, the Inspector General has looked at that. Been critical of these expressions of strong political views, but also said that there was no indication that political bias affected any decisions in either of these investigations. Full stop. You responded to that on Twitter by saying, cool, cool. Like, good, like basically good to know, but it won't make a difference?
It won't make a difference, and it's 2 years too late, right? It's been 3 straight years of investigation by the Inspector General, dozens of lawyers and investigators poring over every investigative step that I took, every text and every email, and they've realized what I've known from the beginning, which is that my personal views had no impact on the course of either investigation. But to my cool point, 2 days later, you see Lindsey Graham in the Senate spend 40 minutes reading text messages again. These are 3 years old. They're been described as immaterial, ultimately, by the Inspector General, and yet we're still talking about them.
We're still talking about them on the eve of the president being impeached. We can't ignore that context. Lisa, I'm going to ask you this in part because I don't have very many other people I can ask this, and you can tell me if I'm off base. But in May 2017, the Russia investigation gets taken over by Mueller. You're involved at that point. You served briefly on Mueller's team. That's how I first came to know your name. Should we, the public, understand that the special counsel's investigation looked at this core, scary question of whether the president was subject to leverage or influence by Russia or any other foreign force? Or was that the kind of counterintelligence investigation that you're talking about before, which is secret, which we'll never know about, which might in fact be ongoing?
So it's really the former. My understanding and what the Mueller report describes is that they were looking at criminal activity, right? So they were trying to determine whether there was a criminal conspiracy to engage in crimes against the United States. They did not look at the counterintelligence sort of relationships between members of the Trump campaign.
Because that was a different investigation?
Well, it was the same investigation at the FBI. I think this was a prosecutorial choice made by the special counsel's office. But while it was still at the FBI, the two were essentially one and the same. We were looking at both simultaneously. The special counsel's office, as best I understand, chooses to focus on the criminal aspects of that investigation.
Thank you for being willing to talk to us about it tonight. This is your first TV interview. I appreciate the trust that it takes to be willing to be here. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, Lisa Page. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.